Hi, so in this video I'm going to talk about the impact that net zero is going to have on big businesses and what that is going to look like and how that's going to manifest and impact on smaller businesses. So with some very bad graphics and some quite rudimentary examples using a bread company, I'm just going to run through the impacts of net zero on smaller businesses and what you can expect in the next year or two if some of your clients and some of your partners are larger corporations. So in this video, we're going to talk through 5 or 6 main key topics, one of which is what is the TCFD, and then following on from that, what is the SDR? These are the 2 main pieces of frameworks or legislation that are really going to start impacting and causing the change to happen within the economy. Next, how is that going to impact you and what is that going to look like? And I'm going to touch on to why Scope 3 is so important within that as well. Finally then, when is that going to impact you? So how quickly can you start getting prepared for this? When is it going to come into effect? And we'll look at a real world example of that happening already as well, which will give a bit more meat on the bones of it. And then finally, what should you do about it and how can you actually start preparing? As mentioned, we're going to use the example of Big Bread Co., which is an imagined company that is a commercial bakery, just as an example to run through some very simple concepts in this. Now, in this video, it's going to be vastly oversimplified some of the topics we're talking about. It's not necessarily going to be as thorough as some legal examples out there. That's not the point of this video. This really is about bringing these quite nebulous and quite vague, often kind of confusing and complex topics down into very simple, rudimentary building blocks so that you can understand it and take action within your business. I'm going to start off with TCFD. So TCFD is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. A lovely, snappy name there. So this is a voluntary framework that typically applies and has been kind of subscribed to by banks, insurance companies, pension funds, investors, a wide range of kind of high-level, large corporate investment funds in various forms. Now, what the TCFD aims to do fundamentally is provide more data about the impacts of climate change and how that's going to impact on corporates' ability to operate and therefore the financial risk that incurs. So it takes a lot of different forms, and for different companies it's going to have different things, but ultimately it is about understanding the risk exposure to supply chains that climate change is providing. And an example of that using the Big Bread Company is that, currently they're producing, they need wheat to make bread. That wheat is getting more and more expensive because the ability to grow it is becoming less reliable. And that means that they can't make as much bread and therefore the bread sales are down. So from an investor point of view, you can look at a company and go, well, actually, climate change is increasing the risk of the supply chain here where it's becoming less stable, less reliable to be able to grow this wheat. And therefore, the financial performance of this company might not be as good because they simply can't grow as much. So really, TCFD is about that financial risk to capital based on climate change and therefore being able to reduce down the risk of climate change to improve financial performance. In a very rudimentary, simple way. It's more complicated than that. The second piece I want to talk about is the SDR. So this is something that's not come through quite as much. There's a good BBC article that is linked in the article, which I'll put in the comments, that explains this in again, a bit more detail. Fundamentally, though, it is building on the TCFD framework, and SDR stands for Sustainable Disclosure Requirements, another very snappy name. It's a really interesting thing here where it does tend to also only affect large companies where it's been released by the UK Treasury and it is aimed at larger companies, but the frame and the wording in it is very slight in terms of the change, but the impact is very powerful there, where it's about declaring the climate impact as well as risk. So the example, which we'll go into in a minute, but a company would have to declare the impact they are having on their climate risk. So while TCFD declares the risk to them of climate change, SDR goes beyond that and goes, how are you contributing to your risk of climate change? Which I think is a really small but very significant example where, again, taking the bread company, if you're running a fleet of diesel vans, that is contributing to your climate risk. So the fact that you're running a fleet of diesel vans is meaning that your supply of wheat, when you're growing abroad or if you're growing in the UK, is becoming less reliable because of climate change. So it's connecting the dots between these elements in the supply chain where you go, actually, the fact that you're doing this here is having a knock-on effect over here. So that is then you being able to declare to investors that your business and your operations of your business is what is also impacting on your own wheat supply. So it's really helping connect the dots and ensure that corporations are starting to understand how they are, in fact, driving their own demise to a certain extent, and from an investor point of view. Now, this is all very big, but we're not really touched on how that actually impacts small businesses. So we're going to dive into now a little bit more about why you should care about this and why, as a small business owner, it's going to impact you. And this is the whole idea of the ripple effect, in that these large companies have got their net zero targets that they're now being held to account for using TCFD and SDR frameworks, which is, again, a very unsexy phrase, but that is putting pressure on the corporations to start meeting those targets, and therefore that is going to start sending a ripple effect out into their wider business, in the fact that for them to meet net zero, they're going to have to start changing how they do business, and that change is going to start affecting you as well as a smaller business, as part of that supply chain, even if you're several steps removed. So again, we'll go through an example later of this, but even if you're not directly supplying large corporations, don't think that isn't going to affect you. You're just one or two ripples away, essentially. To understand this, we really need to understand how net zero is measured. So for a large corporation, and for them to meet net zero, we need to understand how they're measuring net zero and why that means that they're going to then have to start asking their smaller companies for their climate-related information. So very brief, again, very simply, this is a very quick oversimplification, but broadly, net zero is measured in three different scopes. You've got scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is your created emissions, so think your tailpipes and your chimneys. Is typically, do you have an on-site gas boiler, or if you're a coffee roaster, for example, and you're using gas to fire that, that will be your scope 1 emissions. And any vehicles that you own as well will also be your scope 1 emissions, because they are producing tailpipe emissions. Scope 2 is your consumed emissions, so that will be your energy, your electricity bills, typically that, not necessarily much more for smaller companies. It's bigger companies who are maybe leasing slightly more complex machinery or kind of vehicles and things like that, the scopes 1 and 2 do start getting a little bit more complicated. But for smaller businesses, scope 1 is if you have a company vehicle that drives around, that's scope 1. Your energy and gas bills use scope 2. Scope 3 is where the meat of the bones really is, and that's basically everything else. So this is where you can start seeing up to 90%, if not more, of your emissions actually sit in your scope 3, because this is your everything that you buy, everything that you sell, and everything that you throw away. So that entire rest of your business outside of the energy side is your scope 3, and therefore it can contain quite a lot. And that goes for large companies as well. So Starbucks, their 2019 audit, identified that 94% of their, 95% of their emissions were in their scope 3. And that's because, Starbucks probably don't actually own that much stuff. A lot of their stuff is going to be leased, and is going to be through their suppliers, through them buying coffee, moving coffee around, and various bits and bobs that, that entire fabric of their business is going to be very little that they directly own. They don't have a huge amount of their own vans necessarily that they're driving around. Anyway, scope 3 can get quite messy in terms of measuring it, but let's run through an example of what this actually looks like. So what are scope 3 emissions? Your carbon footprint includes all of your suppliers, and that's when I say what you buy, you sell, and you throw away. That includes everything from where you're buying that product from, selling it to your customer, and then your customer throwing it away. Each of those steps is all included in your scope 3. So I like to imagine it as a series of cogs that all connect into each other and all help each other move around. In this example on the left-hand side, we've got your scope 1 emissions, which will be your vehicles, which is the grey cog. You've then got your scope 2 emissions, which is the orange one. And then finally, we've got this turquoise one, which is your scope 3, where you've got all these different other sizes of suppliers within that emissions pink circle, where your suppliers make up your business, and different parts of those are going to be different than others. Because if you're a product, if you're selling bread, for example, you're going to be having to buy goods in to then make the bread and then selling it again. And then after that, it'll be thrown away. And again, we'll come on to an example later with the bread in a more specific case. But essentially, all of your different suppliers and activities in that make up your carbon emissions and make up your scope 3 carbon emissions. So here is the example where we've got, as we said earlier, your delivery fleets, your vans. We've got the people making your flour. For some reason, quite a lot of the stock images were available in black and white. And this is the terrible clip art that I mentioned. You've also got your delivery vans down at the bottom right-hand side, where you might not own these directly, but these might be leased, or these might be using a kind of a third-party haulage company, where that's going to be sitting in your scope 3, not your scope 1, because it's you don't own it. You've then got your marketing company, your HR company, all of the kind of the admin and the tertiary supporting roles there that are going to help your business operate on a day-to-day basis. You've got your ovens, you've got your fridges as a kind of bread manufacturer to keep the bread moving and keep it operating. That's all going to be on your scope 3 as well, because there might be people coming in to service those to keep those operating. And you've got your farmers and where you're buying the wheat from in the first place to make the flour. And you've also got maybe some secondary services like brewers or kind of Vegemite or Marmite or similar services like that, where you're then sending waste product off to be repurposed into a different product and they're buying it from you. That's also going to be your scope 3 in terms of you disposing of that product. So it's a very complex web that really does incorporate everything that you're doing. And as a bread manufacturer, everything from taking the wheat from the field to making it into flour, purchasing that flour, making it into actual bread in an oven, servicing that oven, having that bread then shipped to the customer using a third-party provider, and moving all your goods and the wheat and stuff around using your own vans, using other delivery vans, is going to be all part of your scope 3 emissions. And then that ends up meaning that quite a large amount of your emissions are in your scope 3. That means that all these different cogs that are moving around are going to be contributing quite a lot to your overall carbon footprint. And especially if for a corporation, such as the bread company that's doing this, because they've got such a wide supporting network of their partners and their suppliers, that it's going to really start adding up, and it's going to be a big part of their scope 3 emissions as well, that they need to tackle. So in terms of them meeting their TCFD or their SDR requirements and actually demonstrating they're reaching net zero, they need to shrink that cog down, that this circle needs to be much smaller. And therefore, the quickest way for them to do that, they'll be working on their scope 1 and 2 internally because they can control that. But also they need to be reducing their scope 3 down because it's such a huge chunk of their business. This is where you come in really as a small business owner, where if that large corporation, that big bread co, is working with suppliers that don't have net zero commitments, that aren't aware of this, that simply don't have an environmental policy, they don't have a net zero target, they're not using renewable energy, they're using diesel vans and haven't got plans to replace them at all, that's going to mean that they're working in different directions. So you, as a small business owner, might be running a diesel van, and there are various reasons why you might not be using an electric van, which I won't go into now, but just as a very brutal example, because it's quite simple, if you're then buying a second diesel van and a third diesel van to start running, you are in effect increasing your customer, the person who's buying the bread from you or the flour from you, their footprint is going to start increasing because you don't have a net zero policy and you don't have those plans to replace or reduce down the amount of diesel vans you're using. Therefore, as a corporation, they're going to be blocked by you because they're trying to reduce their footprint down, but you're actually increasing your footprint by taking on more diesel vans. And therefore, there's this frustration and this kind of blockage starts appearing where your customer, the person you're selling bread to, Big Bread Co., can't move forward and they can't meet their net zero requirements, which they're under pressure from TCFD and SDR, because you're actually increasing their footprint slightly. And therefore, what they're going to want to start doing is moving their supply chain to all be moving in the same direction, and they're going to want everyone to be working on net zero and all have these commitments and be working in, over a series of time. This isn't an instant thing. This isn't saying you need to switch diesel vans today, but more you need to be aware of the fact that your diesel vans are a problem to your customer, and therefore you need to start reducing down and have a plan for phasing those out over the next 5 to 10 years, or even sooner if you can do it even sooner. So that corporate client is going to need you to be working, and is going to need to be taking their entire supply chain all to be working in the same direction as well. All of those cogs that make up their business, everyone's going to be having the same issue, and they're going to be going to each of those companies and saying, look, we're trying to move towards net zero. You're currently, slowing us down a little bit. How can we work with you to try and accelerate this process and make sure that we're all moving in the same direction rather than moving against each other? And this is where the acceleration comes in, because all of those blue cogs, all of those turquoise cogs, make up that carbon footprint, and therefore, if all of those turquoise cogs are working on shrinking themselves and reducing their own carbon footprints down, that means that pink, the large corporation's carbon footprint can start to shrink down as well and become much smaller. And this is where the idea of 2025, 2030 targets start coming in, because the quicker that everyone starts reducing their own carbon footprints down, the quicker that the whole economy starts kind of shrinking their footprint down as well in a very positive way. The reality is obviously far more complicated than this, because each of these companies is connected into each other, and each of these companies has got multiple, tens, thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of suppliers that they're working with to operate their business on a day-to-day basis. And therefore it is a very complex thing to achieve. But as an idea, it's very simple in that if you can start reducing your footprint down and being aware of that and communicating that to new customers that you're working with in a B2B setting, it's going to make everyone's lives a lot easier. A real-world example of this to show that it's not just me waffling on, and I've put my image over the logo there, but Tesco's. I'm sure you want to know what Tesco's logo looks like. Their suppliers, they announced this just before COP26 last year. It's kind of October 2021. Their entire supply chain, and again, Tesco's is a good example of a company that's going to have a huge supply chain here. They had to declare details of existing emissions by the end of 2021. Declare net zero ambitions by 2022, and then a net zero strategy by the end of 2023. So they're effectively giving their entire supply chain 2 years to come up with a net zero strategy, which I think is fair enough. 2 years is quite a long time for a lot of small businesses. And the fourth option they gave them, the fourth kind of recommendation they said was to switch to renewable energy as soon as possible, mostly because that's the easiest quick win for most small businesses. So this is an example of Tesco's really going out there and saying, look, we've got ambitions to be net zero by 2035, I think it is. And again, details are in the article. But what we want to try and do is, here's a roadmap for our suppliers to start doing it. Now, the important thing here is that they've not said this is a requirement yet, and it's more of a suggestion that they need to start working towards. It's a sign of intent. And I think the important one is declare details of existing emissions by the end of 2021. So you need to be at least thinking about this and at least have that kind of very basic environmental policy in place where you've looked at your emissions and gone, this is roughly what we think it is. I don't think necessarily it has to be 100% accurate at this stage. I don't think Tesco's would require that, as long as by the time you get to 2023, you do have a more accurate roadmap towards that. The important thing here is more about having a statement of intent that you are at least trying, rather than just having absolutely nothing to say for it at all. So in terms of what you should do, really I think there are three main things here. One is write an environmental policy, because that environmental policy is then going to be a single page on your website or a single document that you can point all of your customers to, all of your businesses to, when they come and ask you, because they are going to eventually. Might happen now, as we've seen with Tesco's, where they're already asking their customers for this information, or it might come in a year's time when Tesco's ask their first supplier, who then turns around and asks their entire supply chain as well. Because of the way that Scope 3 works, every supplier in their supply chain is going to have a supplier as well, and eventually we're going to see this rapid expansion of people asking each other for what their net zero targets are and their environmental policies are, because the corporations at the top are forcing that kind of ripple to come down the chain. So, one, write an environmental policy. I don't think it has to be anything complicated or legally binding necessarily. It just needs to be a very clear set of actions that you've taken in regards to net zero, in regards to your actions that you are trying to do. Not having one, I think, at the minute is a very dangerous position to be in, where if you're bidding for new work, certainly banks, local councils, any tenders you're going for, and any larger corporations are going to require at least a very basic policy to say that you're looking at it, and not having it is going to look very bad. Secondly, I think set a net zero target. So again, we saw that Tesco's required their businesses to have a target by the end of 2023. This is quite a challenge because it's going to be different depending on your company. But if you're unsure, I would probably go for 2025, because as a small business owner, you can move very quickly and you can rely on offsets quite heavily to bridge gaps in technology that may not be available to you right now. If you're really, really uncertain, maybe aim for 2030, but even then I think that's a little bit unambitious because of the speed of which the small businesses can move out here. And certainly from a sales point of view, if Tesco's or if Big Bread Co came to you and you had a target of 2025, that's music to our ears, because that means that our problems are going to be much easier by that point. Whereas if you're saying 2030, we may start questioning what that looks like, and is that actually in line with realistic achievements, or is it a little bit too, is it too easy? Finally, measuring your emissions. I think this is a really simple thing to do, with a certain caveat on that in terms of your accounts-based data, where you can actually use your existing accounts information to get quite a lot of this data already. Certainly scope 1 and 2, so mileage, your kind of mileage, your fuel usage, and then your energy bills in scope 2, so your gas electricity bills. That's data that will exist then there already, that very quickly a lot of tools out there will just take that information, do some maths on it, and give you a rough estimate already. Scope 3 becomes a lot more difficult, but there are accounts-based packages out there, one of which we'll be linked to in the comments as well, into the description, that will very quickly give you a lot of information about your scope 3 and the potential emissions there. So that measuring of your emissions is going to be fairly, it sounds quite scary, but with using accounts-based methoding and taking existing data you've already got, it can be much quicker than you think. And again, it doesn't have to be entirely accurate, but just taking that information and having that on an environmental policy page to say, look, we're looking into it, this isn't 100% accurate, but it's better than nothing, bear with us while we work it out. That's still going to be music to the ears of corporates compared to someone who has absolutely nothing. So in summary, just to go through what we've learned in this slightly longer video, corporations are under increasing investor pressure to meet net zero, and you're going to need to start really responding to that because their supply chains are going to start coming under pressure as well. And if you're in that supply chain at any point, you are going to need to start demonstrating things. Small businesses are in that supply chain at some point, whether it's a HR company, whether it's a marketing company, or whether you're selling wheat to the big bread company. These are all companies that are going to start needing to respond to this at some point. Tesco's are already doing it, and we've seen that kind of pressure demonstrated at the end of 2021, 22. So really, you need to start acting now, and the sooner you can get basic information in place, the better. Please do check out the description for kind of launch off points of where you can find more information on where you can take your next steps to understand this. Thank you very much if you've made it this far through all of the terrible imagery. And yes, good luck with your net zero journey.